Thank you very much, Rebekah, for that intro, and thank you to Dane Colleen and to Michelle and Amy and Simon and others at FLI for the pleasure of being able to speak to you today on this critical life issue. Go forward in hope. That's the theme of this conference. You know, it might seem counterintuitive, really, to look upon the events of the last few years and see anything that is remotely hopeful. We now have a euthanasia law in this country. We fought it hard, and we lost that battle. And as people who believe in a culture of life, that's a bitter pill to swallow. And so this really now is a time for us of reflection. It's a time of refocus, and it's a time of a rejuvenation of our hope. That is very important. And today I'd like to share with you a few of my insights into those issues. What I think we need to do is we really need to know how and why we've got here, where are we headed, and finally, what are we supposed to do? And today, let's have a look at some of those issues together. So, where have we come to, and how did we get here? I'd like to start with a spiritual insight of Father Jeremy Pullman's on how we got here, and I think that can help to maybe contextualize this presentation. And then I'll offer you a legal perspective. In his 2016 presentation entitled Euthanasia, a Demonic Caricature of Mercy, if you haven't watched it, I recommend you do. It's on YouTube and it's fantastic. And I watched it back in 2016 as I was entering this debate. And I was glad that I did at that point in time. Father Jeremy provides a very compelling analysis of how our societies are being led into acts of great evil that are being presented and accepted as good. Back then he argued that the fight against euthanasia was already lost. It was already lost because we are arriving at the apex of this enormous battle where societies are being led into what Pope St. John Paul said, meta-temptations. A meta-temptation, as you probably know, is a temptation which Pope John Paul says goes beyond everything that has been in the history of humanity, and in which we see modern humanity slowly undergoing a great temptation to deny God and to worship man. And Father Jeremy then traces this temptation back to the Garden of Eden, back to when the serpent presents to Eve evil masquerading as a good, denying the goodness of God by presenting God as a tyrant who is oppressing her. And then, of course, she is tempted to commit an evil to avoid what she thinks is a greater evil and to achieve a greater goodness. And in modern history, we've seen that meta-temptation repeated again and again in the past 100 years, particularly in abortion. And now we see it in euthanasia, where the evil of taking another's life is now presented as a good, something to avoid suffering, something that is compassionate. You know, even the adjectives that are commonly used in palliative care, compassion, mercy, they are now being hijacked by this movement. And we are the ones who are now immoral because we are seen as some people who are lacking in compassion because we oppose the right of a person to die to avoid their suffering. That is a spiritual insight. How has the legalization of euthanasia occurred in the context of this meta-temptation? Well, let's start our analysis back in the wake of the Second World War. We go right back to 75 years ago this year, 1948. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly. After what had just happened in Europe, humanity decided it was quite important to sit down and remind ourselves of some very basic truths. And with that became the advent of what we now know as modern international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights came about in response to the barbarous acts of the Nazis, which, according to the Declaration, had outraged the conscience of mankind. And in Article 3 of that Declaration, we proclaimed the most important right of all, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And that right is the cornerstone of many a great constitution. Not a single one of those drafters in 1948 could have possibly intended, let alone foreseen, at that time, just 3 years after the end of the Nazis' euthanasia and eugenics program, that this right to life and liberty and security, which they had just enshrined into international law, might one day be interpreted by a court way down the line as including a right to die through euthanasia. And yet, as Malcolm Muggeridge famously once said, it takes only a few decades to transform a war crime into an act of compassion. So let's examine how, on the euthanasia front, this fundamental human right to life has been so twisted and corrupted in the highest courts of our lands and in our parliaments in just the last decade. You see, for a number of decades, the Universal Declaration led to courts across the world rejecting numerous attempts by pro-euthanasia advocates to try and change the law, to try and interpret their constitutional rights as somehow justifying euthanasia. And these euthanasia lobbies were unable to find anyone who was prepared to give them what they called was a specific freestanding right to die. So what did they do? Well, they began arguing that their right to die was somehow part of the right to life itself. Now, for many years, those attempts were rejected in multiple jurisdictions in the UK, the US, Europe, and Canada. In Canada in the 90s, in the famous case of Rodriguez, the Supreme Court of Canada found that Mrs. Rodriguez, who was a terminally ill woman wanting to end her life, was not able to show that her right to euthanasia, as she called it, was being undermined, and that Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Freedoms, their constitution, the right to life, security and liberty of the person, somehow helped her in that argument. So the court threw it out. And then in the 90s again in the UK, we saw the famous House of Lords case of Airedale. And in that case, the House of Lords concluded that no euthanasia law could possibly hope to be acceptable. That was just back in the 90s, so not long ago. And in that case, Lord Gough commented that if we permit a patient permit a doctor to take the life of a patient in any circumstance, then we cross the Rubicon. And when we cross that Rubicon, there's no going back. And New Zealand has also been no exception to these relentless attempts by pro-euthanasia lobbies to argue the same sort of rights. We saw over the last 2 decades a number of cases before the courts of mercy killings and arguments that they could be justified by our Bill of Rights. The courts have resisted, the pressure has mounted, and then finally, in 2015 actually, the dam burst in Canada. This time, the Supreme Court of Canada, in the case of Carter, had a plaintiff before her, Mrs. Carter, who wanted to die through euthanasia. And this time, the Canadian court looked at the Section 7 right to life, liberty and security, and through some very unusual mental gymnastics, managed to locate a right to die in the right to life. This is how it did it. It found that Kay Carter's inability to get medically assisted suicide violated her right to life because it forced her to end her life prematurely because she was unable to get medically assisted suicide later. You see, what she argued before the court, in fact, what Lucretia Seals in this country in the High Court in Wellington in the same year also argued before the High Court, was effectively saying to the courts this. They were saying, if you don't allow us to seek medical help to kill ourselves later, then we might just do it now. And if we do, then Canada law and New Zealand law is responsible for our deaths. And therefore, the law has breached our right to life, at least in the short term. So you need to give us the right to end our lives now or later in order to save us from committing suicide now. That was the argument. You know, it's an astonishing twist of logic to say that the state should provide a means of committing suicide as a suicide prevention measure. Remember those arguments. That's exactly what was argued. But ultimately that argument won over the Canadian Supreme Court in the Carter case. And to borrow from Father Jeremy's analogy, just like Eve in the garden, that court was seduced into sanctioning an evil in order to avoid a greater evil and in order to achieve a greater goodness in its own view. And then that decision in Carter then had the effect of forcing the Canadian government to bring into action a new law, a euthanasia law, which now, just 7 years later, is killing nearly 10,000 terminally ill, chronically ill, mentally ill and disabled Canadians each year. In New Zealand, the same argument didn't work for Lucretia Seals in her case, but it didn't matter because the Seals case then became the catalyst for Marion Street's petition to the Parliament, and then of course for David Seymour's end-of-life choice bill. And both politicians and both their campaigns relied heavily on the Supreme Court of Canada's case in Carter, and in fact the text of our own End-of-Life Choice Act, the wording of that act, borrowed substantially from the Canadian legislation that was enacted following Carter. And so to a large extent, Canada's law has become our law. Canada's era has become our era. And so while international law's history is only 75 years in the making, what we are now witnessing is that same law being turned on its head, being put through these cartwheels of interpretation in order to justify state-sanctioned euthanasia. So whereas this right to life that's enshrined in our Universal Declaration was once thought to protect all life and to prohibit the killing by euthanasia or assisted suicide, it's now been completely inverted to justify the very things that its drafters abhorred. And in our own country, up until November 2020, our law protected human life, well actually, born human life. Unequivocally it did. Under our Crimes Act, the crimes of euthanasia and assisted suicide were the crimes of culpable homicide and aiding and abetting suicide. Now, we had those criminal laws for hundreds of years, since we first became a country and for many years before then. They underpin the very nature of our social relationship or our social contract with our Crown. These fundamental laws. We give the Crown our allegiance in exchange for the Crown's protection. That's how it works. But what's happened now is that the Crown has withdrawn that protection in this case. These criminal laws reflected our belief as New Zealanders, at least up until late 2020, that we don't help people to kill themselves. We don't kill people, and we certainly don't kill weak, defenceless, vulnerable people, and we don't allow our government to do it. So what went wrong? Well, as a country, we have been seduced. Seduced, it seems, by campaigners who scaremongered with stories of patients in intolerable suffering, who the only solution for them was euthanasia. Seduced by our inflated sense of autonomy, and seduced by our desire for choice. The "my life, my choice" mantra was the apple that was dangled before this country in our own euthanasia referendum, and 2/3 of the country grabbed it. Let's talk about that briefly. The "my life, my choice" lie. It's trumpeted up and down the country. And it resonates with Kiwis because we are an autonomous people. We want freedom. And so, the "my body, my choice" has now been replaced by the catchphrase "my life, my choice." A lot of people like to hear that. But it's a lie. It's a lie when it comes to euthanasia. Because in reality, when it comes to choice, New Zealand is not a level playing field. Some New Zealanders clearly have more choices than others. Let's have a look at an example so that you understand where I'm going with this. Let's look at the case of two Kiwis, both men, both in their 60s, who both get lung cancer, okay? Let's call them Jim. Let's call them John and Jim. Here's John. John lives in his Parnell mansion. Successful guy, previously the CEO of New Zealand Incorporated. He's worth about $70 million. And he gets lung cancer. He's close to the best resourced hospitals in the country. He's got private medical insurance. He's got lots of money. He can buy the cancer drug Keytruda to keep him alive for many years. And if that doesn't work any longer, he's got the best quality palliative care and other care right at his fingertips. And he's got a family to care for him. Lots of choices. If John gets cancer, then euthanasia is truly his life, his choice. Here's Jim. Jim is a sickness beneficiary. He lives alone in state housing in the far north. He's divorced. He's isolated. He's lonely. He's depressed. And he's got lung cancer. He's got no money. He's been refused Keytruda because Pharmac won't fund it. He's got limited access to his GP. He's got little or no access to palliative care because of his location. So if he chooses euthanasia, is that his choice? Can you see the stark contrast? When we say it's your life, your choice, who are we even talking to? The rich, the capable, the confident, yeah, they get lots of choices. The poor, the weak, the defenceless, they get euthanasia. Just like the temptation in the garden, choice is an illusion. You and I, we might have quite a lot of choices if we get sick or terminally ill. But what about all those other Kiwis for whom the End of Life Choice Act might actually mean my life, no other choice? There are hundreds or even thousands of mostly elderly New Zealanders out there right now who don't really have any choice about their end-of-life care, or whose choices are very, very limited. And so how can we say to those people, if they become terminally ill, it's your life, your choice? So choice is a vacuous word in this debate, but you know, it's so seductive, and it's worked. So where are we headed? We've looked at where we've come. Where are we headed? What does a future of euthanasia in New Zealand look like? The euthanasia advocates will say it's great. It's going really swimmingly, according to David Seymour. Can we keep it limited in this country to just terminally ill people at the end of their lives? Well, I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. In purely human terms, the future is very bleak. Very bleak. Because it's going to get a lot worse. And that is a logical certainty. And the reason it's going to get a lot worse is because we have crossed the Rubicon. Do you remember the English court case that I just mentioned before? In that case, the English House of Lords said quite prophetically, as we will soon see, that once euthanasia is recognised as lawful in any limited set of circumstance, there is no logical reason for excluding it in any other circumstance. You know, as Professor Theo Boer, who was one of the pioneers of the Dutch euthanasia legislation, who had a change of heart, he warned us. He said, don't go there. He said, once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't get it back in. And he was exactly right. You see, the only logical trajectory of euthanasia is expansion. That's it. That's what it's built to do. As the former editor of The Australian, Paul Kelly, put it this way in 2016, experience in other jurisdictions leads to the unambiguous conclusion the threshold event is the original legalising. After that, there's only one debate: how to expand the sanctioned killings. Because if we give it for end-of-life pain relief, how can we deny it to people who aren't dying? If we give it to adults, how can we deny it to children? If we give it to people in physical pain, how can we deny it to people who are in mental pain? And if we give it to people with mental pain, how can we deny it to people who are exhausted with life? This isn't going to stop. The conversation has not ended, as people thought it would when they voted for it in the referendum. It's just begun. Our old friend is back again. This time he's pushing for expansion beyond the 6 months to live limit. He wants it to be at least 12 months, even longer. Okay, there's a petition that's just been launched calling for advance directives to be introduced so that people can plan their euthanasia in the future. And soon we'll be hearing about chronically ill people in unbearable suffering. And then it will be mentally ill people in unbearable suffering. Eventually we're going to hear about a 16-year-old who's got terminal cancer, denied their right to die. And why not? Why not? We've seen it in every other jurisdiction that has a euthanasia program. You know, David Seymour says, no other country with euthanasia has ever gone back. That's because there is no going back. Once you have it, you go into expansion. Let's look at the Netherlands. The Netherlands, since legalisation in 2002, 21 years, the number of euthanasia deaths has increased 260%. 80% of the deaths are of the elderly. And after the law came in, they began euthanizing newborn children. Now they're euthanizing chronic psychiatric patients. There's a mobile end-of-life clinic that goes around the country euthanizing people whose GPs refuse to give them euthanasia. And in recent years, of course, we see more and more petitions to Parliament to basically extend euthanasia to anybody over the age of 70 who's tired of living. Over the border in Belgium, over the last 20 years, legalisation has seen the number of reported deaths increase tenfold. In 2014, they expanded the law to include children. Since then, at least two children aged 9 and 11 have been euthanized by lethal injection. There's been a steady increase in the number of euthanasia deaths for people with dementia and psychiatric disorders in Belgium. particularly mood disorders such as depression, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, neurotic disorders, schizophrenia, and so on. And then there's Canada. Canada, as you know, was held up during this debate in New Zealand as the exemplar of a good, safe euthanasia law. Originally, it was restricted to people whose death was reasonably foreseeable. Okay, so basically terminally ill. And they predicted, at that time, in 2016, just a few hundred cases a year. But we've seen rapid expansion. 5,500 people in 2019, 7,500 people in 2020. Then in 2021, the Canadian government expanded the definition to include non-terminal illness and disabilities, and the number of euthanasia deaths increased to 10,000. This year, they've expanded it to cover people with mental illness. Children are also on the horizon. That's what happens when we cross the Rubicon. Well, let's look more closely now at our problem, the New Zealand problem. And you'll have to forgive me for drawing this analogy after what we've just been through in the last few years, but I liken a euthanasia law to a virus. Once it's in the system, it infects, it mutates, it expands, and eventually it destroys the host. Here in New Zealand, we've caught it. But not only that, we've caught it at perhaps the worst possible time for our most vulnerable citizens, for our elderly, for our sick and disabled. And we have to appreciate that for them, these are now the conditions for a perfect storm. Okay, firstly, we have a rapidly ageing population. Around 22% of New Zealanders are going to be aged over 65 by 2032. It'll be close to 30% in the next 25 years. Now, any demographic expert will tell you that that is a disaster for a country. You know, it raises the question of how are we going to be able to function as a society when so many of us are going to be elderly. But in addition to that, we see a whole range of what I would say are coercive forces at work in our society towards the elderly, at a time when this euthanasia law is just starting to kick into action. There's the coercive force of loneliness and isolation amongst our elderly. 1 in 5 of our elderly are living in extreme loneliness, according to a study done in 2017. That's 150,000 elderly people. You know, in Canada in 2020, 20% of the Canadians who were euthanised reported isolation and loneliness as one of the main reasons underlying their request. There's the coercive force of hopelessness and depression. Most medical reports will tell you that anywhere between 25 to 75% of terminally ill people will be depressed at some point. What about the coercive force of elder abuse? 1 in 10 of our elderly are victims of elder abuse. That's about 70,000 people. Half of the abuse is financial, 80% of the abuse is psychological, 79% of the abusers are family, and nearly 50% of the abusers are their children. Then we've got about 300 cases before our courts each year of inheritance disputes. Then we've got the coercive force of isolation and neglect. Old people living apart from their families, neglected, uncared for. What about the coercive force of not wanting to be a burden? That's a big one. You know, in Oregon in recent years, nearly 65% of those who chose medically assisted suicide said that one of the main reasons they chose it was that they didn't want to be a burden on family, friends and caregivers. In Canada, it's about 37% of people who tick that box. Then we have the coercive forces of failures in our healthcare system. We know all about those. Every day we read stories about our health system failing people, failing the terminally ill, mentally ill, chronically ill, disabled, and especially Māori people, Māori New Zealanders. We had a Waitangi tribunal claim which was upheld some years ago, which claimed that the health system was sick and racist towards Māori, and they won. Then there's the danger of coercive forces being applied by a future government. I call it sort of market forces in the healthcare system. You know, that's what worries me looking ahead. Let's look at a few fiscal realities. In New Zealand, our elderly currently occupy about 45% of our health budget of the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Health is the same department overseeing the euthanasia regime, of course. Our healthcare system is at breaking point because of overcrowding and underfunding. The health system is failing a number of terminally ill people. We know those cases, the Blair Vinings, the Nikki Balls. We know that our palliative care system is grossly underfunded and survives largely on donations, op shops and fundraisers. Or the organisation Alzheimer's New Zealand says that the government support services for Alzheimer's patients is woefully inadequate. Meanwhile, overseas in Canada, they're commissioning a report that's found that you can get a huge amount of savings from euthanasia. When that program first kicked off, an initial report found that the government could conservatively save at least $130 million a year. That was when they predicted a few hundred deaths a year. Right there, you've got 130 million reasons why Pharmac will love this particular law. Here's another thing that really worries me. Toxic pathologies. A group of Catholic bishops in the US use this phrase to describe the threat of euthanasia. And that is the very real coercive force that will now likely emerge that because of euthanasia, the virus is spreading. And what is it? Well, it's the coercive force of what we see from these other countries who legalise it, of a profound shift in attitude towards the terminally ill, the sick, and the disabled and the mentally unwell. The profound shift in attitude that comes with the euthanasia law. It's the toxic social pathologies that creep into public consciousness. The idea that some lives aren't worth living, that some people really are better off dead. We're already seeing those pathologies at work in those countries where euthanasia has been legalised. And I'll tell you how it happens. When you introduce a new law that creates a right, because this is what euthanasia now is. Euthanasia is now a valid healthcare service. It's a legal entitlement. It's your right to have it. When you introduce a new right, the law initially wraps around the new right to protect it. Then, of course, the law and the government start to promote the right. Eventually, gradually, it becomes socially acceptable. And then, eventually, it becomes socially expected. Social acceptance becomes social expectation. If we get cancer now, the question is, when are you going to start chemo? That won't be the question in 15 years' time. The question then is, what are you going to do? Because there won't be enough money in the coffers for chemo at that point in time. And in any event, you shouldn't be putting your burden on the taxpayer system by staying alive for too long. We know what's expected of you, and that's why they're queuing up. The elderly are queuing up for euthanasia in the Netherlands and Belgium. So that's the expectation, you see. That's the expectation that starts to creep in. Do the right thing. Think of your kids. Think of your children. Think of the burden. Think of their inheritance. You know, like every year you hang around, you know, you're spending their inheritance, and they can't even get a mortgage to buy a house. Here's the latest toxic social pathology. This one's come from Canada.
Dying in a hospital is not what's natural, that's not what's soft. And in these kinds of moments, you need softness. Last breaths are sacred. When I imagine my final days, I see bubbles. I see the ocean. I see music. I see cheesecake. Even now, as I seek help to end my life, there is still so much beauty. You just have to be brave enough to see it.
All is beauty. Euthanasia is beautiful. 6 years I've had that law, and that's an advert that's just been put out by a fashion label in Canada. Euthanasia is beautiful. So much for choice. You see, what this ad failed to mention was that woman, Jennifer Hatch, chose euthanasia because she couldn't get the care that she needed for her illness, EDS. She's just one of the thousands of Canadians who are being unjustly starved of the medical care and attention that they need each year for their illnesses, who are choosing euthanasia. So we have Canada plunging towards this human rights crisis where the Canadian government is offering euthanasia to the citizens that it can no longer care for. That is our trajectory. So much for choice. So the final question. Where do we go? What do we do? Where do we, as people of life and hope, put our hope? Where do we put our energies? We've been knocked over by this one. It really, I think it affected a lot of people, this loss, if you like, this loss of something. And I can see many of you right now slumped. Well, let's roll up our sleeves. What do we do as people of life in the face of this desolate panorama? In the face of this culture of death? How do we go forward in hope? We know the drill. We know the drill. As Christians, we know the drill. We have to get out there. It's what our Pope wants us to do, very much. We have to get out there. And I know that I'm preaching to the converted on this, but I'd like to share just a few insights or a few thoughts on this. First, we have to get educated. Oh wait, no, we've just done that. Okay, we know the enemy. We know what we're up against. We know what he's up to. So what can we do? Well, let's first adjust the question. Not what can we do, but what can I do? What can I do? Sometimes with that collective mindset, we somehow inadvertently miss the opportunity and even inadvertently shirk our responsibilities because we think this is our problem, and it is our problem. For sure it's our problem. But it's sort of our responsibility. Why isn't the church doing something? Why aren't doctors doing something? Why aren't lawyers doing something? Why aren't they? Well, hang on. What about me? What am I doing? What can I do? And I think we can prayerfully reflect on what our own individual responsibilities might be going forward in a euthanasia regime. The first thing we do is we fight with words of truth. We have to fight these toxic pathologies. We have to speak the truth to the lie, and we have to do that with every step of this threatened expansion, which we know is going to come. You know, although publicly during the referendum and during the euthanasia debate, Seymour and the proponents of euthanasia, they wanted to pitch this as a religious versus non-religious argument, And so those of us with beliefs had to adjust our arguments and adjust our focus and say, this is not a religious argument, because we were trying to appeal to people who had no religion. Okay. But now that we have a euthanasia law, this is very much a religion versus non-religion matter. I really think that. I think that by and large, people of faith tend to be opposed to euthanasia, and people of no faith are in favour. And why not? Once we remove God from the picture, why not have euthanasia? It's an easy victory for the pro-euthanasia camp. Because why have unnecessary suffering at the end of life if there's nothing beyond it? I found this quote along the way by a Canadian journalist. I want to read it to you. A society that believes in nothing can offer no argument even against death. A culture that has lost its faith in life cannot comprehend why it should be endured. We have to be the opposite of that desolate mindset. Whereas we fought the legalization of euthanasia on secular arguments to try and win over our fellow country folk, now I think really is the time for us to shine as people of faith and hope and light. We have to keep speaking the truth, and we have to keep standing up for our most vulnerable, and we have to educate and keep trying to win over our fellow Kiwis one by one in both our public and our private discourse. Win them over about the incomparable worth of the human person. Will we find hearts to listen? Well, the final referendum figures were 66%, 65%, 37%, I think. So, roughly 2/3 of New Zealanders voted yes, 1/3 voted no. That was pretty good. And even in that 2/3 who voted yes, I estimate half of them were diehard, for want of a better term, diehard euthanasia supporters. But the other half weren't. They were the mushy middle. They were the ignorant, the maybe indifferent, the undecided. They didn't really know. We can win them over still if we gave them something to think about, something to care about. In the public sphere, the media we know is already fueling expansion. That's where it's going. So I think each of us needs to consider, how could I respond to that article that I just read? Not like someone needs to respond to that article. No, how can I respond to that article? Or how could I contribute something to this narrative? We can write op-eds. We can generate our own stories. We have to create a compelling and positive counter-narrative. We can't be silent. For those of us who are in the professions, we might ask ourselves how we could contribute by way of our voices, our writings within our professions. Medical journals, medical conferences, law journals and conferences, education. So that's the first. We have to speak our truth. We have to fight then these toxic pathologies with our deeds. That's even more important. We've spent the last few years admonishing. Now is the time for personal witness. See how they love one another was what the early pagans said about the Christians, and now, as always, that is the challenge for us. And so it's business as usual in the Catholic Church, in Christianity. We have to love our neighbour, we have to love one another, we have to be active and we have to be creative on this front, because our opponents are very active and very creative. And we have to be active and creative too. On a personal level, what could we do? I think those with young families, really we need to develop a plan for consciously raising our children to really value and cherish all life. We have to inoculate our kids against these toxic pathologies. It's a tragedy they're going to grow up in a society that has it. But we have to prepare them for the world. We have to really, I think, teach our kids the catechism. Read Humana Vitae with our teenage children. Discuss it. Read our papal encyclicals together as families. We have to. We could reflect, here's one, we could reflect on the different spheres of influence that we individually have in our lives. Within our families, our workplaces, our friends, our neighbourhood. Look at FLI. 30 years ago, I don't think Dame Colleen started out thinking I'm going to save thousands of babies. It was just one baby at a time, one mother at a time, befriending mothers, caring for them, reaching out to them, finding them. Well, but now she can look back and say, well, thousands of babies have been saved. And I think we have so much power individually if we start to adopt a similar mentality. How can we spread a culture of life to the spheres of influence in our own lives? It's not, euthanasia is not a taboo topic. It's not like abortion. And not yet anyway. We can have this conversation with people. People actually do care about this issue. And there's a lot of undecideds on it. So, we can start the conversation now before it becomes taboo. We could also, maybe in our reflections, we could ask ourselves, what am I doing to protect the elderly in our communities and to restore honour to them? Restore honour to them. Because so many of our elderly now live in rest homes. What do I have to do to search out and love anyone who is elderly and infirmed and maybe lonely in my community? We know they're out there. Maybe it's starting regular visits to the nearest rest home. Asking to see the elderly people who are not visited by anyone. Taking our children along. Nothing lights up an elderly person's face as much as a child. So we have to seek out people. We have to protect our elderly in particular. What about money? Where can we put our money? We could donate to hospices. The palliative care sector in New Zealand is in serious jeopardy and it needs our money. The euthanasia budget in the Ministry of Health is about $11 million a year, and they have 6 full-time staff working on the euthanasia program. There are no full-time staff at the Ministry of Health headquarters working on palliative care. And we know that the palliative care sector is grossly underfunded. So we need to really help out there. I think, here we go, there was an article recently, The Underfunded Invisible Mess of Palliative Care. I recommend you read that. It's a really compelling article. Then there's the field of education. I heard an informal poll recently which said that up to 80% of Catholic high school students are pro-euthanasia. We have to reflect on that. We've got to do something about that. We need to address this problem. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, we need to be out there educating our children, re-educating our children, showing them the lie. We really need to re-educate. One final point, though, is we can't shirk this, and we won't. We are people of faith. We will roll our sleeves up. We will get out there, as we are commanded to do. But one thing I think that could really help, and that is to remind ourselves of this essential truth, that each of us is perfectly made for the time in which we live. This is the juncture in history that our Creator has put us, individually. Not accidentally, not incidentally, but perfectly. And for a reason. And as Pope St. John Paul said in a homily in Victory Square in 1979, he said, "The history of each person unfolds in Jesus Christ. In him, it becomes the history of salvation." So individually, I think we have a role to play. And may we draw our strength, of course, by contemplating perhaps the apex, well, definitely the apex of human suffering and desolation, but also the source and the summit of our salvation. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the times in which we are perfectly placed. Can we stem this tide? Perhaps not, but we probably won't die trying. Thank you.